Welcome to Just Curious. Today I'm joined by Mike Mays, founder and managing director of Egoless Consulting and former partner with BCG's Digital and AI Group. Mike has spent over 20 years leading AI strategy, product innovation, and digital transformation at the intersection of financial services, insurance, and enterprise technology. Today we'll explore two key topics: how to avoid the common mistake of treating AI as a hammer looking for a nail instead of a strategic enabler, and how AI is fundamentally transforming business processes, requiring leaders to rethink not just technology, but also workforce dynamics. Mike will share real-world insights from his work implementing AI in complex industries like insurance, banking, and human capital management. Mike, welcome to Just Curious.
Thanks, Stuart. Nice to be here.
Tell us a little bit about Egoless Consulting, what you're focused on, and how you ended up here.
Sure. So many moons ago, I studied architecture of buildings, thinking I was going to design skyscrapers and hospitals and whatnot, but ultimately got really excited about digital and internet. Started my career in product management, product design, and spent a number of years focused on, customer experiences and customer journeys. And then after some time at BCG in the consulting world, decided to step out on my own and really think about the connectedness of all of my experiences. So what is it that architects do? Well, they bring together client needs and locations and design ideas and really try to sort of transform the built world. Egoless is about the intersection of people and process and technology, and where can AI take us, but also just where should companies be thinking about transforming their business and their strategies, really focusing on customers and sort of leveraging the best way to do that, right? And we're trying to think about where the middle market businesses are playing in particular, given the importance they play in the economy around the world.
Awesome. Let's talk about transformation. You said that too many companies implement AI without a clear strategy. Why does this happen, and what can leaders do to avoid it?
Yeah, so there's so much hype right now around Gen AI, and the pace at which it's moving is so fast that there's a bit of FOMO, right? Like everybody is afraid that they're going to miss out or they're going to be behind, and so I think they're reactive to getting their hands on all the toys and the shiny objects, and so that's sort of one piece of the puzzle. The second is that it's such a new technology that oftentimes the technologists within a company are the ones who are trying to lead the way and sort of drive usage of the tools, themselves. What really needs to happen here is, the business needs to understand what the business strategy is and what the company's actually trying to achieve, which is probably the same thing as it was the day before AI became popular. You've set out this strategy. You want to, triple the size of your business by entering new markets. You want to reduce costs by, 30% through process and people transformation. You have the same business needs, and that's where the AI strategy really needs to come from. Direct connection to, solutions that are going to drive those business outcomes, really, right? And if you're public as a company, then it's really also about shareholder returns. It's not about just playing with the newest technologies.
Yeah. And so you're a company, you've got some strategic priorities, some problems you want to solve, obviously some goals, which are maybe to generate attractive returns. When you work with companies and you take that approach, what's the first step that you take to ensure that AI as a solution aligns with business needs and is actually meeting a problem?
Yeah, this is a really good question and a good starting point for companies, right? So let's say you have three major strategic priorities, and a lot of companies right now are thinking about AI for efficiency. So let's use that as an example, believing that you can drive, you want to drive 15 to 25% efficiency in your business, sort of, lower the cost to run your operations, right? You've grown, and now you're looking at ways to try and streamline that. So if that's your business goal, the first thing that I would do is look at the operations that are, sort of in play, right? So where is the value created in your business, and where is the cost in your business? And typically you can do that by kind of mapping out either user journeys or customer journeys, internal processes, and start to really see what are those activities that are generating value for your business. In insurance, maybe it's underwriting. Maybe it's something to do with sales effectiveness, lead generation, and throughput of your sales team. And then you can look for major pockets of cost, which could be, say, customer service or claims. And so as you map out these value chains and start to see pockets of either growth value or opportunity cost, that's where you then zoom in, right? And you start to think about what are different solutions. And this is where, AI is one of those solutions, but there may be other ways you can go and think about solving that problem, right? And this is another thing I say is like businesses still have all the same problems they had before AI became popular too. It's not like all those things went away. Need to restructure your data, need to onboard and hire and retain great talent, need to find ways to efficiently and effectively grow in new markets, right? The problems are still the same. So you're really looking for these opportunity zones across your business and then thinking about which of those is going to really drive the strategy, right? So where can I apply change to make the biggest impact on my business strategy? And then within that, can I explore ways that AI might be a solution? So AI is not great for everything
Yeah.
yet, but in some of those places, it could be a really good tool, right? We're seeing a lot of benefit in customer service solutions and self-service, driving down cost of calls. We're seeing really powerful solutions in marketing, lead generation, customer acquisition, and we're starting to see interesting things even in processes like underwriting and risk management. Again, I'm talking about the worlds that I know, which are financial services, insurance, and some of those spaces, but a lot of it can apply across any industry, really.
Yeah. And when you look at those opportunity areas, are there certain criteria that stand out as lending a high likelihood of the solution being AI powered? Are certain like
Mm.
attributes of a workflow or a process that should jump out to people as like this is probably a likely AI use case, and others that are this is not a likely use case?
Sure. Yeah. So there's a couple inputs to this that I think you have to think through for your company, right? So data is really important to provide to the large language models and to be able to train it for certain use cases. So do you have enough data and information to drive the outcome that you want? Or is the LLM, already smart enough and knowledgeable enough about what you're going to ask it to do? And I think that's a particular spot of interest. Risk management and closeness to your core business is another interesting conversation to have. Do I want to leverage a tool? Do I want to give up a certain amount of control to a model and to this language capability? And is it going to introduce risk? Where that really comes into play is how accurate do I need the answer to be? And how sure am I that it's going to do the right thing without a human in the loop or without other ways of protecting against it? So when you think about, credit policy, lending, other things that really involve money, there's some questions about, how much control you would give over to the AI tool, right? And then on the other side, I think there's a bit of sort of the people process involved, just in terms of how can this improve the lives of people who are involved in my business or as customers, right? So knowledge workers are a big target for a lot of AI capabilities. How can I take some mundane tasks or repetitive rote tasks out of the flow of knowledge workers and really empower them to do things that are more around their skill set or why I truly hired them, right? And so there you start to see some interesting use cases in reporting, analytics, other kinds of like data analysis that can then create, opportunities for data scientists, engineers, financial analysts, right, to do some more interesting work. So those are like a few pieces of the puzzle in terms of like where you might go to start. And then one other thought is like the generative nature of Gen AI becomes really interesting around marketing, messaging, writing emails, drafting proposals, right? So the ability to really quickly turn content is a superpower right now that I think a lot of people are like experimenting with, playing
Yeah.
with, right? And you're seeing that the most. And so I think people are getting more comfortable in that world.
What are some red flags that indicate a company is deploying AI for the sake of it rather than solving a real problem?
Yeah. So one area that I see a lot of people post about and a lot of information out there is like get started by just giving your employees a co-pilot and like let them play with GPT and figure it out themselves. I actually disagree with that. I think it is it's interesting, but it's not going to really help your business. I think finding specific use cases and really guiding employees, in your company to think about where to truly deploy this capability is going to be more successful. So I don't know if it's a red flag, but I think it's sort of a misdirect for how some companies are trying to get started, with AI. The second one, and this might also be slightly controversial. I'm not sure. But if it's the CTO driving the agenda, I think that's also wrong, right? If it's coming from the tech team in terms of what we should do with I think you're going to end up in the wrong place.
Yeah. And so you recommend like business leaders empower the functional unit and business unit leadership to one, kind of own how AI should be deployed within their specific units, to identify those use cases, and then I guess to collaborate with the tech organization in terms of how do we, having identified logical use cases, now deploy a solution.
Yes, and let's go there, right? So here's where I think the business is the one that has the problem to be solved primarily, right? I can come back around to technology in a second, but it's really the starting point should be that, the business has a problem to solve, a strategic goal to achieve. They are in charge of like what they want, right? But not how it gets done. So let's say it is an example where your marketing and sales department is seeing, a decline in an increase in customer acquisition costs, a decline in your sales success ratios, and you're burning through leads, and your contract volumes are either stagnant or decreasing, right? That's a problem. You're trying to grow your business. Okay, so what can we do about it? Well, I have certain goals where I want to achieve a Salesforce effectiveness. I want to get to, a certain acquisition cost, collaborate with the technology folks and your data teams and others to sort of understand, right? What can we do differently? What do we know about the data? Where are we getting our leads, et cetera? So define your problem space, define what you think the answer is, and then let the technology team decide, oh, okay, we need, a RAG-based architecture to do something, or we should use, Claude versus OpenAI versus some other solution, or here's the way we want to structure the data. The business doesn't need to be involved in that at all, but the collaboration and the upfront work is like, are we solving the right problem? And has it come from a business perspective, right? Versus a technologist saying, hey, I heard that AI is really good at making, marketing better. Let's go do that.
Yeah. Right. Yeah. You really have to understand the domain in which you're deploying it to use it effectively. We
Yes.
talked a little bit about how AI is going to transform business processes. It's going to lead to a radical change in workforce dynamics. How should companies think about workforce planning when implementing AI?
So here's where there's a little bit of like, what's the ambition of the company and how interested in, being bolder they are, right? And so there's a couple ways you can look at it. There's a sort of a slower path, which is we're going to bring in AI, we're going to kind of change a bunch of tasks, but we're not going to change jobs, right? And so you'll see some localized efficiency when you do that. So if you have, a growth manager, a marketing manager, a copywriter, maybe those are still three separate roles within marketing, give them tools, and within each of their jobs, they're going to be more effective, right? But you haven't changed the jobs themselves. So there's a local starting point like that where you'll get a certain amount of efficiency and return on your investment. The next layer would be a company that's saying, hey, I'm ready to look at the whole process end to end and break down the barriers between people's tasks and jobs, and recognize that the idea of a copywriter may actually go away as a role because of the tools and the ability of AI to jump in and play most of those tasks. And now a marketing person has a new job function and a new set of activities. And so as I've redefined that, now I have impacts on my hiring plan or how I manage attrition, where the team is sitting in the overall organization. And I'm starting to look at how I might even hire differently. So there's cascading impacts the more you want to change. But what we see is that the more you're willing to break down those barriers, like the more value you can create long term, right? So that's why it's important that, like, outside of even just the business stakeholders and technologists, you want to have most of the leadership engaged in these discussions and say, look, there's human capital impacts, there's CFO impacts, there's legal impacts, right, of how we may be restructuring some of these roles and how far we want to take it. And this is not a 6-month, journey. This is a 2, 3, 5-year situation for larger companies who are dealing with, thousands of employees. One other thought to this that I've seen be really successful, it's a little bit scary for some big companies, but it works, is engage those frontline employees in the conversation early and help them see like the power of the tools and understand that they can like redesign their role as part of the process, right? And so if you get the right people involved early and the right buy-in and they're thinking about transforming, even their own jobs, it can be a really powerful experience. Doesn't work for everyone, but in a lot of cases, especially knowledge workers, there's some really strong opportunity and like higher levels of adoption when they're involved in the process.
Yeah. And what role should companies be playing in reskilling their employees for new roles, given the transformation you just described, which is that one, new roles are going to be created, old roles are probably going away. What should companies be doing in the interim?
So I think the best companies are going to take a really active approach to this and really plan the future and think about there used to be some stats that said like hiring the wrong person can cost your business like $60,000, right? Or something like that. And it's always or not always, but it's often more powerful to try and like take someone who you've hired and redeploy them to other parts of your business, right? There's all this overhead to like getting them up and running and teaching them. And so when I think about some of the best companies out there, one that I actually worked at, Capital One, as roles evolve and they bring in, they really think about you as like a generalist or a T-shaped person who can move and be part of different strategic objectives, right? And they redefine your role with you and move you to different parts of the organization. So for the best talent, I think companies should and will really invest in kind of redeploying people to new roles, being active with learning and development, making sure that people understand how their role might change and what the opportunities are. I think it will also, technology like this is going to shine a light on the underperformers who, won't necessarily have a place in the future or haven't been able to adapt to, a new kind of role. And so that'll, I think, be part of the outcome.
Yeah, awesome. We touched on earlier in our conversation the first steps to using AI effectively, which is to find a need, a problem, decide what is the right solution. Maybe it's AI, maybe it's not. Can you share an example of how you've helped someone do that? I think we talked a little bit about in a prior call using Gen AI to analyze contracts. And
Yes.
so I'd love to hear a little bit more about that process, where it started and then where it went.
Sure. So this was last year, mid 2024, a large specialty reinsurance firm was interested in two things. One, from the technology perspective, where can we go and do something with AI, right? And sort of a desire to test and learn. And then paired with a business leader who said, we have 10,000 contracts that we write, and each of these is worth, hundreds of millions of dollars in the reinsurance world. There's all this legal language and evolution of contracts and all these components. There's inclusions, exclusions, amendments, core phrases, and they get really complicated really quickly. It's hard for humans to keep up with all the changes and over years and years of time to understand how these contracts have evolved. And so it creates risk essentially at the end of the day in the system where underwriting or claims or even just the way that the company is positioning its balance sheet, right, has uncertainty that they wanted to better control. So that was the problem statement there, right? A desire to test and learn paired with this business need to kind of get their arms around risk management in a more consistent, faster way. And so we sat down with the leaders of the risk management team, some underwriters, some people from claims, some of the upfront sales folks to, again, map out the sort of value chain of steps, right? Like what do you go through to create the contract? When and where is it iterated on? What data is captured in which systems? Where does the problem come up when you're trying to understand reactively risk management? So, a cybersecurity incident occurs. Well, across 10,000 contracts, there were varying levels of cybersecurity language. How do we codify each of those and know exactly what the risk exposure was by industry for that company, right? So I want to look at all my industrial buildings and know how many millions of dollars of exposure do I have. I want to look at all the contracts I have in South America, or I want to look at all the contracts I have that don't include cybersecurity information. So all these different parameters that came up for them. And for us, it was mapping out those value chain steps and thinking about different use case activities, or sometimes we call it jobs to be done. So a new contract gets entered into a system. Well, in the old world, it was a human keying in 45 different fields of data. Sometimes they only put in 20, sometimes they put in 45, sometimes they made mistakes. And then you have issues with data capture and tracking, checks and balance processes. Where can that be, revised with technology? And so you're highlighting the jobs to be done that seem like AI is most valuable to the solution and is going to solve the problem, which was more clarity on risk exposure, faster turnaround time to get answers, better data accuracy, for example. That was the approach that we took to think about where exactly the technology should live.
Yeah. What were the biggest technical challenges to making something like that work?
Yeah. So in this case, accuracy was really important, right? And even a year ago, a lot of the Gen AI capabilities weren't tuned to accuracy. So they're much more about summarization and sort of general, awareness, if you will. So getting a technical solution that was fast enough and accurate enough was a big challenge across 10,000 contracts, each of them potentially 100 plus pages with very specific language and data. So the contract may mention dollar amounts of coverage, dates of expiration, regions where coverage occurs that could then be mapped to like zip codes, for example. So specific data, but then also language that talks about inclusions and exclusions that's very legalese. And so we had to do a lot of training and a lot of specific work to make sure the technology understood this legal language that's reinsurance specific.
Uh-huh.
So it's almost like a custom LLM built on top of OpenAI that was fit for purpose to this particular company. And then they had a series of rules that they could continue to update and refine as like a dictionary that the LLM used. So that's another part of the technology is to say, you got to customize on top of this for your business and for your use cases.
Yeah. How do you de-risk a project like that in the early stages, given concerns around, specificity, these being complex and kind of high stakes processes, and the, concerns certainly a year or so ago, but still today about hallucinations and non-deterministic outputs? How do you de-risk that going in?
Yeah. For us, it was bringing sort of lean thinking, agile thinking that, startups might use from a process perspective and say, okay, let's take 10 contracts and manually look at those and do a manual review with the risk managers and underwriters and confirm what the answers are, run it through the prototype solution and figure out how to ensure its accuracy with 10. And where are we seeing challenges and where do we need to like tune the code? Where do we need to give it better instructions? From there, we went to 100 contracts, right? And sort of ran the same process. And then we did like a almost, I don't know what the right terminology is, but we also then used the tool to generate its own contracts with very specific parameters so that it already knew the answer of what was in, what was out, what was included and excluded. And then in a new version of the tool, we ingested all those contracts and then asked it the questions, and it sort of did its own like QA, which was pretty novel at the time, to start to then think about scaling, right? And then once we felt like we had our arms around accuracy and we knew how to maintain at the time sort of 97% accuracy, we then could work on some of the other challenges, which might be speed, right? How quickly can we ingest all the contracts? How often do they change? If I ask certain types of questions, how can I ensure a reasonable response time to a user? So if I want to ask a question that goes across all 10,000 contracts, how fast can I make that happen? And what are some technology ways I can do that, right? And so for us, it was where do you deploy an AI model versus a SQL query versus, different types of caching and stored queries, and then be able to have an agent sit on the front of the user experience and interpret the question, right? And if I'm asking how many contracts include a cyber terrorism clause, well, when we ingested, we identified that, we were able to store that as a data value in a SQL query. And so very fast, boom, right? But if I asked, for all the contracts in South America, what are the most common cyber terrorism clauses? Well, okay, now that's a very different question. And I have to go and I have to pull X number of contracts. I have to find that clause. I have to evaluate it, right? And then come back with some summarization of common language, differences and similarities, and give the user a different answer. So some unique challenges to figure out, like what are the problems to solve there
Yeah.
at the next level of detail. Yeah.
And in terms of that early problem space sort of mapping, how important is the job to be done framework
Mhm.
to finding the right solution? I'm curious because on the one hand, laying out the steps in a workflow are going to help someone understand maybe which steps are appropriate for an automation or appropriate for generative AI. On the other hand, the jobs to be done framework may open up the potential for solutions that look nothing like what was done in the past because you can do things differently today than you could a few years ago. So how do you balance sort of like kind of breaking down a process or workflow step by step versus saying like, okay, that's great, and I know that's how we used to do it, but like here's the job that we want to accomplish, and let's think sort of outside the box about
That's
how
right.
we can solve it.
That's right. It's typically a really good framework to establish a baseline, understand how things work today. Where is time spent? Where might there be waste in the process? Or where is the value really created? Right. So you can start to see if I pick the wrong leads in my sales cycle, that's a huge detractor to value in my business. Right. If I sell at the wrong price, like that's a huge detractor to my business versus, I don't know, the way that I handle like customer support. Maybe that's less of a major lever to my business. So it helps you shine a spotlight on certain areas that are either value creators or detractors from a activities and jobs perspective. At that point, I like where you're going, Stuart, which is to say, well, what's the ultimate outcome you're trying to achieve? And that's where we might go through what we call these like how might we exercises to try and break you out of today and say, hey, like, what's the future, right? And there's some fun activities. Oh, I think they're fun that we might take you through and say, well, okay, you're a specialty reinsurance company, you're a 100-year-old business, but what if Google decided to become a specialty reinsurer tomorrow? How would they do this? What if Amazon decided to suddenly sell reinsurance? What would they do differently because they're a very data-driven company or a tech-driven company and start to like break the mold and focus on the outcome and then rethink that whole end-to-end process. And they say, well, we wouldn't do any of this stuff that our company does today. We would just go right to that step. Or
Right.
we would just buy a bunch of data and we would throw it in a computer and make the computer decide. Can work people through activities like that to then kind of rethink the outcome.
Yeah, awesome. In terms of AI tools that you're using, what's something you're using now that you're excited about and that others should be looking at?
Yeah. So I will admit that I have accounts and like paid accounts now with Claude, ChatGPT, Perplexity, DeepSeek. I play with each of them because they seem to each be moving so quickly and have different sets of features. One thing that I find really valuable on ChatGPT is a projects feature. So you create a project and you can start to add all kinds of documents into that project and it saves them and it starts to learn everything that you've given it about that project. So as you go back and ask more questions, it's pretty cool. Some of the newest ones to me that I've been trying to get my arms around, there's a platform called make.com and then another one called relevance.ai. These are like leading edge agentic solutions that can take a bunch of different tasks and stitch them together and drive an outcome. So, for example, I was doing some competitive research on a particular company. The make.com actions, you give it the name of a company, it goes to LinkedIn, it gets the information from there, all the blog posts from the company. It finds the company's website. It goes to their website. It looks at all the information there. It can find information about the executives. It can drop all of that back into a Google Sheet or a document for you and basically tell you everything, in terms of the value prop of the company, how much money they've raised, who their investors and leaders are, the top 10 people there, what they think the roadmap might be because the blog posts are indicating where the company's going. You could tell it to go look at 10Ks and annual reports. It'll pull that data in a matter of minutes, right? Something that would have taken a person a week
Yeah,
or a team of people, days can now happen in a matter of minutes. So for competitive intelligence, market research, lead generation, a lot of things like that, these agents are really, really powerful and they're just going to continue to get smarter and have more activities that you can connect them to.
great. In terms of those listening to this and watching this and wondering whether Mike and Egoless could be a helpful partner to them, what types of organizations you spoke to a few industries, but what types of organizations, personas are you a best fit for?
Sure. So I'm somewhat of a generalist, but I definitely can deep dive, and Egoless is focused on financial services, insurance, human capital management, right? There's expertise there, and I know those businesses well. But it's really any company who's saying, I'm having either headwinds, like achieving my strategic goals this year, and I want to think about a different way to solve the problem, or I'm looking at how can technology make me more efficient and more effective in my business, right? And let's look at the various operations and value chains, and like where are you leveraging data to the best of your ability? Where is technology playing a role? How can you be most organizationally effective? And we could do that across sales, marketing, finance, internal functions, as well as everything that your business is trying to do, right? And where you're trying to grow.
Awesome. Mike, this has been a insightful conversation. I appreciate you coming by and sharing your perspectives and the examples that you've provided. And yeah, thanks again.
Absolutely. Thank you, Stuart.
Cool.